This episode of RealAg Radio is brought to you by Ag Expert. Go from field to farm with Canada's most trusted, most secure farm management software. Ag Expert keeps you on top of it all, no matter where you are. Get started for free at agexpert.ca.
It's time for RealAg Radio on Rural Radio Channel 147 on Sirius XM. RealAg Radio and RealAgriculture.com is your home for insight and analysis of the issues that are impacting your farm business. Let's get real and get connected with RealAg Radio.
Hello and welcome to RealAg Radio here on Rural Radio Channel 147. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, filling in for the birthday boy, Sean Haney. Yes, it was his birthday yesterday. I don't know if you mentioned it, but he doesn't like to make a big deal out of his birthday, so I like to make a big deal out of his birthday. So everybody, if you missed it, if you could head over at Sean Haney on Twitter, you can find him on other social media as well. Let him know that you were thinking of him on this belated birthday. This is a week that Sean and I talked about this, and actually it was Calvin Hepner who brought it up a couple weeks ago, who said, we've got a very huge anniversary coming up, and not a good one. And that is the anniversary of the finding of BSE in an Alberta cow. And that's 20 years. It's happening on Saturday. The news did break over the May long weekend, just like the anniversary is this weekend. And so we are spending quite a bit of time on that topic this week. And today's show is no different. So I've got a few other things, of course. I've got a quick recap, a clip I pulled from Monday night's Agronomists. So we are going to talk some agronomy. And then I've got a very important discussion with Peggy Brekveld at OFA about a bill that is in the government right now that desperately needs some edits, let's call them. But then I've got a very special guest. Miss Kelly Daynard is going to join me. She's with Farm and Food Care Canada now, but she was with the Ontario Cattlemen's Association when BSE hit Canada. And so she is going to share the crisis communication side of this event. All right. As always, if you've got any feedback on today's show, you can call that RealAg feedback line 1-855-776-6147, or you can find us across social media at RealAgriculture or use that hashtag RealAg Radio. All right. Let's get to the show.
Boron is an essential micronutrient for plant growth, and without boron, your crops can't absorb the macronutrients they need for higher yields. Although borates occur naturally, boron deficiency is a common soil problem. Whether in direct soil application, through fertigation, or as a foliar spray, U.S. Borax has the right refined product for your crops. U.S. Borax products are specifically formulated to combine with other fertilizers, lowering your application costs. Learn more at borax.com/ag.
How's your seed quality? What should you treat with? What about herbicide carryover and environmental concerns? Spring is here, and you've got a lot of things to think about in regards to your pulse crop. The Pulse School on Real Agriculture has information and advice for all these questions and more to help you navigate this season. Brought to you by BASF. Pulse School episodes are available at pulseschool.com, realagriculture.com, or as a podcast on your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio on this Wednesday, May 17th. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith. And are you looking to simplify your sulfur solution on farm? Get BioSol Premium Plus from GFL Ag, the unique combination of compost and elemental sulfur that provides a cost-efficient, logistically friendly, agronomically sound, long-term, and environmentally friendly sulfur solution to your farm. Learn more at gflagri.com. That's gflagri.com. All right, and so for this segment, I thought I would think way back in my file to Monday. That's right, Mondays, 8 p.m. Eastern, live on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, you name it, you will find The Agronomists. So it's hosted by myself most weeks, and we tackle one particular topic with two experts, a couple clips, a couple slides, lots of comments from those watching live, and we have a super good time. So on Monday's show, Clint Jurke from the Canola Council and Alison Robertson from Iowa State University join join me to talk about rotten root rots. And it was a fantastic conversation. So I've clipped just a portion of Monday's show. If you want to check out the full show, you can go to realagriculture.com/agronomists. That's with an S. And you'll see not only Monday's show, but all those previously. So here is part of my discussion with Clint and Alison.
We do a lot of screening, looking for new resistance genes. Just recently, we did a big survey across the Midwest. And most of the commercial varieties here in the US have the 1A, 1C, 1K genes. 3A, 1C, and 1K genes. And what we're finding is that a lot of the Phytophthora population across the soybean region are able to overcome those genes. And so those genes are no longer effective. And really, we need to be putting some new genes into the germplasm. But the other thing is, as well as that, we know that we can have a lot of different races in the field. And so really, we rely more on that field tolerance to Phytophthora sojii. In terms of the other root rot pathogens, the Pythium and the Fusarium, I am involved with a big project that's being led out of Ohio State, first by Ann Dorrance. She's about to retire now. But we are finding resistance to Pythium and Fusarium. That project is funded by the United Soybean Board. And so the breeders who are on that project are starting to come up with lines that can be used for breeding. Of course, that's not race resistance, right? Because we don't have races with Pythium and Fusarium. That's just general background tolerance, field resistance kind of thing. But yeah.
So for any of these, of the major ones, and we can go through a few of them, they're condition specific, obviously, yes, but they can have host specific. Some of these, of course, get shared. So yes, what role, and Alison will pretend that there is rotation in Iowa, but what role can rotation play in trying to manage some of these? Are there some that, actually benefit from rotation, or are they just so endemic and there just aren't enough crops in the mix?
Phytophthora sojii is host specific, right? So you would think rotation would help with that, but then Phytophthora sojii produces those oospores that survive in the soil for lots and lots of years, right? So rotation doesn't help there. And then Pythium and Fusarium, they have such a wide host range. They can infect alfalfa, canola, wheat, corn, soybean, So, I think when it comes to these root rots, rotation is, in my opinion, right, is not really going to help a whole lot.
Unlike other things, which it does. So, Clint, I'll go to you. When we can talk about other things too, but for root rots, same idea. If we're dealing with something like Pythium, we have too many hosts.
Yeah. A longer rotation in general is a good practice, just in terms of reducing some level of risk, but it doesn't solve all of our problems. Unfortunately, it reduces risk, but there's a big risk profile, and so it might knock it down like one or two steps in that larger spectrum. If a producer is growing canola after canola after canola after canola in a just year after year for a multiple, you will end up just increasing the level of that pathogen that is becoming more and more adapted to specializing on canola in particular. So breaking that up as much as you can is a good idea, but it's exactly as Alison said. There's the Fusariums and the Pythiums. They're happy feeding on pulses and on cereals, and on many weed species that we have in our fields as well. So the spore load is really not going to diminish that much, unfortunately. And it's going to be the other environmental conditions that are going to have a bigger impact.
Right, that are going to dictate these things. So in having said that, and Peter, you're forgiven for shouting at us, that rotation certainly helps reduce root rots in edible beans. Edible beans are special though, Pete. So so dry beans, edible beans, they're special. Now, I'd love to know which particular ones, Peter, you're referring to, if there's one in general. But Jason, I sort of read your mind there, so mine melds. But so further to this point, if we're alternating between corn and soybeans, screening genetic resistance is important, but rotation's not going to do anything. So what other practices are part of the mix to try and get ahead of some of the root rots?
Seed treatments will help. Really, I think the key is, can we get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible? Because that's going to reduce your risk. And so when you plant and the seed and the soil temperatures stay below 10 for the next 3 weeks, right? Below 10, those soybeans and those corn seeds are just sitting there, just leaking all these nutrients, and all those seedling pathogens think it's Thanksgiving, or I don't know, I can't think of a special Canadian holiday. But
we also have Thanksgiving. It's just
you do?
earlier. Okay. Yeah, it's just in October.
So, those seedling pathogens, those root rot pathogens are just like yum, 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 right? And so I think that if we can get that crop out of the ground quicker, then we reduce risk a whole lot. And so maybe like timing planting, keeping an eye on the weather when those soil temperatures are increasing, and then just getting in there. And if we can just have good soil temperatures for a week, if they drop back down again, for a few days, that's okay, because that crop's ahead now. It's at a safe stage. If it gets infected, it'll just be a nibble. It's not gonna devastate that crop. Mm-hmm. I don't know. What do you think, Clint?
He specializes in canola. We don't do the greatest job at getting canola up and out of the ground. We've made some inroads.
It's so cold up there.
Tough. Well, and it's a teeny seed.
And that is the secret.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you need to get that crop out of the ground as quickly as possible, because those seeds, canola seeds, they just don't have a lot of energy. And if they have to come through 2 inches of soil, they'll expend a lot of that energy, and they need to start photosynthesizing as quickly as possible. And then it can build its defenses against soil-borne pathogens. So getting those cotyledons to sunlight as quickly as possible is key. But as well, like the other agronomic factors that are important are just ensuring that the crop is going to be healthy through that early part of its life cycle. Is there going to be mechanical damage, like feeding from insect pests, that can reduce the risk? It can just stunt the crop. It can hurt the crop, and now it has less reserves in which it can fight off any diseases. We see that later on in the season, where insects like root maggots, they tunnel into canola roots, and then that becomes a wound for Rhizoctonia and other root pathogens. So the best that we can do at fighting off all of those other troubles, and fertility as well. Like if the crop is deficient in any aspect of its growth, then that's going to have an impact, as well as their energy and their capability of fighting off root pathogens.
All right, and now we're going to head to a break, and I will be back with Peggy Brekveld, president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture, to talk about Bill 97 and how it's set to potentially divvy up Ontario farmland. Infuse some energy into your next corporate event, customer meeting, or conference with RealAg Radio, Canada's national agriculture radio show. Create a unique experience at your next event with host Sean Haney, broadcasting RealAg Radio live on SiriusXM, featuring exciting guests, captivating interviews, and the latest news from the agriculture community. Contact advertising at realagriculture.com or call 587-787-1795 to book your on location with RealAg Radio today.
As you head out into the field this season, The Corn School's got you covered. Everything from tillage discussions, weed control info, field trial results, yield strategies, and more. The Corn School on RealAgriculture.com has the information and advice you need to help you succeed. Brought to you by Pride Seeds and BASF. Corn School episodes are available at cornschool.com, from realagriculture.com, or as a podcast from your favorite streaming service. Download the latest episode today.
Did you know that Pioneer now has a full lineup of Enlist E3 soybeans? Take a look at Pioneer brand Enlist E3 soybeans for the highest yield potential and for the best agronomic package and herbicide trait options. From the lab to the field, Pioneer brand Enlist E3 soybeans are the best in beans, period. Ask your local Pioneer representative about Enlist E3 beans.
Welcome back to RealAg Radio. I am your host today, Lyndsey Smith, and this segment is brought to you by Granubor from US Borax. Ask for it by name. Joining me now on the line is Peggy Brekveld. She's the president of the Ontario Federation of Agriculture. How are you today, Peggy?
I'm very good.
All right. So I have been digging into this for quite some time. Of course, preserving farmland in the provinces is one thing that's near and dear to my heart. But of course, OFA has been, spearheading a awareness, I want to say, campaign for the importance of farmland in the province. And when we look politically, that has taken on a few different sort of, let's say, pinch points with the provincial government. The most recent one that I'm trying to get some information on is Bill 97 and what that might mean for farmland. So, Peggy, please explain this to me, because I can't seem to get any straight answers out of anybody.
Yeah, so just a touch of history. We actually started talking about preserving farmland long before government moved towards the serious and actual issue of we need more houses in this province. We know that farmland is kind of a solid base of where we grow our food and how we do it, the importance of soils. So we started a campaign called Homegrown. In the meantime, government has come to a very strong conviction of the importance of building houses. OFA agrees that we need to build more houses, but we're saying only 5% of the province is arable land, and we need to protect that and grow food for Ontario, Canada, and the world. With recent bills, we've watched a lot of pressure occur on farmland, and in Bill 97, actually the biggest concern for the farming community is allowing additional residential lot severances to every farm property in the province. And that will have lasting implications. It will actually, it has the potential to kind of neuter the livestock sector. And presenting this to committee, I actually joked and said, I don't know if you can almost neuter something, but this is going to cause huge problems. It's about the number of acres it will take out of production. Mm-hmm. Wayne Caldwell, formerly from the University of Guelph, suggests that even if there's simply 1 acre lots, it'll take 145,000 acres potentially out of production. Mm-hmm. It will add pressures on the road as farm equipment moves around, as more people complain about normal farm practices like smell and light and noise and dust. But most importantly, we in Ontario have the minimum distance separation calculations. Mm-hmm. And they were created for in response to the Walkerton crisis. That's right. And they're there to protect both farmers and homeowners from risks to our water supply. So they were created using the best math possible to say, how do we protect the homeowner supply, ensure normal farm practices? What it means is that if we allow all of these severances to happen, the minimum distance separation will basically push the places where you can build either new livestock facilities or expand livestock facilities or nutrient storage, manure storage, etc. And we actually, this is actually really significant. Mm-hmm. when we saw pictures of this, it looks like if we put the houses along the edges of a concession, there's potentially 30 lots available around that concession. And depending on the size of your livestock operation, there are places where you would not be able to build and places where there's only a very small circle in the very middle of the field that you could build. And that also means, is actually the soil the right kind there, right, or is there a creek nearby, et cetera? So significant potential impacts on our livestock sector. So there's a couple other things too, but that's the main.
Okay. So, and I want to get into those in a moment, but I just want to clarify. So this bill, and you're exactly right that the government really is very focused on housing, on creating more housing units, which we all know in Ontario, it's true. We need more housing for the people that we have, for the people that are going to come here. So for now and in the future. So, but this, I just want to clarify, essentially, the bill proposes that any one piece of farmland, is there a minimum size of that? Is that 1 acre, or is it just as long as it's designated farmland? Do you know?
We are not aware of any minimum size of property, farmland property that could have these 3 severances.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then it would allow up to 3 severances per farmland piece.
Property.
Yeah, per property.
Yeah, per property. Yeah, so on my farm, I have 4 properties actually. So potentially, if I wanted to, we could sever an additional 12 lots.
Right.
Yeah.
So, okay, and so you've brought, I think, exactly right. One of the key things we need to think about is what that potentially means for the intersection of, someone who buys a 1 acre lot and builds their dream home, but it's surrounded by farmland. You've got more equipment on the road. You've got, we all know what happens when people want to move to the country and love the country, and then they find out the country has things that they don't like. So to me, it does bring up all sorts of issues, not the least of which is the fact that we lose each of those acres, exactly that, to food production. But as you stated, for zoning, for siting of new livestock locations, whatever that might be, that complicates things immensely. What are some of the other considerations or concerns that OFA has about this potential bill?
So one of the additional challenges is this increased strength in ministerial zoning orders. The Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing can change zoning on different pieces of land with less and less of those natural protections, such as agricultural impact assessments, etc. And so there will be less protection on your specialty crop areas and class 1, 2, and 3 soils. So we've already seen some significant acres lost to MZOs. Another piece is that settlement areas around, so basically if you have a settlement area, they can expand their borders without justification. And again, we have a lot of farm property that does abut against a settlement area. Those hubs need to be healthy, etc. And we actually really believe that we'd love to see more housing building in and up in those settlement areas. But this ability to just expand at a whim seems very short-sighted. Organizations like OFA and government, they have this opportunity to think long-term and strategically. And we would really like to see that as we look to where do we put houses and are we going to feed these people?
So, and that is, of course, a key part of this is that, realistically, if we think about the average person in Ontario who maybe is struggling to find, suitable housing, those sorts of things. I mean, they clearly, yes, we need more available housing, but realistically, what is the connection so far with, the average Ontarioan? Is that what we call ourselves? Sure. To me, we need the general public on side to say, yes, we want more housing, but yes, we want farmland. Because I just feel like, and perhaps it's surprising, and maybe some people listening would think, well, this government has been supported by rural areas for the most part, if I can say that generally. Yeah. But of course, this one really does sort of butt up against a lot of what agriculture is asking for or wants for this industry and for the people of Ontario. So have you reached out to, or how do we as an industry reach out to consumers and say, this bill needs changed so that it meets these needs of being able to feed you and maintain green space and environmental goods and services and all those sorts of things?
So once again, I want to say we really do need healthy hubs and communities, and we do support that housing does need to happen in this province. Mm-hmm. In fact, a piece of this actually talks about something that's very similar to towns, and that is this ability for farm properties to build on the farm footprint an additional house, or so for perhaps dad and mom, perhaps for employees, on the farm footprint. And actually OFA says that makes a lot of sense, just like the towns, city lots are now allowed to put in a granny suite and a basement apartment, etc. That makes sense. That's part of our solution for housing in our area. But the more important one is we actually, the severances are the problem. Mm-hmm. And that is maybe that first generation understands farming, maybe it's dad. But we know from statistics, retirement lots generally are held by the retired person for an average of 3 years. Mm-hmm. And then it goes into anybody. The last piece I'll say is that we have enough land. Building houses, the challenges isn't about a lack of land. In fact, there's more than enough acres already designated for building in the province that we could do the 1.5 million houses that they'd like to build. It's not about where to put them. It's just how to do it. And do we have enough workers actually to build those houses in the construction industry? I want to be able to say OFA is definitely in support of the housing. We just have to do it with wisdom and thinking about those long-term farming needs. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, and you bring up a good point about, realistically, there are places to build. There is this ambitious goal of 1.5 million homes, which I'm not sure how that's broken down as far as, how many people that accounts for, because a home can be a 2-bedroom apartment, or a home can be a McMansion. So, I don't know what designates it a home, but you bring up an excellent point, though. Do we really need this kind of allowance in the laws for severances when realistically it might be a struggle to get these homes built on existing projects? So it's an interesting point, and probably one where, really we should be focusing on perhaps what's at hand as opposed to divvying up a whole bunch of farmland.
I have to say the province has done some really great things lately. We've talked about the Grow Ontario strategy. They did a summit not that long ago in consultation with the industry. We've talked about the dollars that they've put towards veterinarian students to help pay for their tuition if they work in rural and remote places. I think there's some really neat things happening. One of the big announcements in the budget was the soil mapping they plan to do. Interesting enough, that's the last piece that I'll say we're concerned about. It's not the only piece, but another piece. And that is they've taken out the language that says we need to map agricultural systems, and instead the province will no longer be mapping agricultural systems, and instead municipalities can. The words go from we shall to we should, and the responsibility is pushed down to the municipalities. Agricultural areas are healthiest when they are a system, when there's lots of land continuous in areas, which include both the infrastructure and support and allow farming to happen normally with very few pressures. And placing houses all over kind of pushes the limits of a healthy agricultural system. And I think, again, that's about long-term planning. And when we're going to map soils in such a short time forward, as the province has put some dollars to it, it seems strange we will build houses first on them.
Without actually having, and because we certainly know that once a house goes up or a strip mall goes up or a school or whatever, that land does not ever return back to the agriculture system. So it's a permanent change. Absolutely. All right, Peggy, thank you so much for this. We're going to keep tabs on it. I guess my only last question would be sort of what happens next? Is this something that, there is still chance to have some of these modifications made? or what is sort of the next step in Bill 97?
So it's right now in front of committee. All people are, I really do hope that citizens will call up their MPPs and say, you know what, this isn't healthy for the agricultural industry. I would love to see, if you feel comfortable, send a letter. Putting it in writing is even stronger. And certainly push the issue that, agriculture matters. Farms and food forever, that's not just a saying, that's a lifeline for everybody.
All right. Peggy Brekveld, thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, with that, we'll head to a break, and I will be back with Kelly Daynard. She is currently with Farm and Food Care Ontario, but we are going to step back in time 20 years ago to the BSE crisis here in Ontario and talk about what it was like to be manager of communications for the beef producers at that time. Hear that right after this.
Want to get the best out of your soybean crops? Whether you've been growing them for a generation or are just starting into soybeans, find what you need to know at soybeanschool.com. You'll see videos on growing tips, pest control, and much more from specialists across the region, all in one place. Easy for you to access from your desktop, tablet, or mobile phone. Maximize your yields by staying up to date with the Soybean School, presented by BASF, Pride Seeds, and Syngenta Canada.
If you're involved in the agriculture industry, it's important to stay informed on all the latest issues affecting your business. At RealAgriculture.com, we offer fast, reliable news, information, and insights to help you keep on top of all of the latest in Canadian agriculture. Visit RealAgriculture.com and sign up for our free daily newsletter covering everything from news, agronomy, animal agriculture, and much more. Visit RealAgriculture.com/subscribe today.
Whether you're seeding, harvesting, or anything in between, the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com has you covered. Timely agronomic information from industry experts available online anytime. Give your wheat crop a good start and a great finish with the Wheat School on RealAgriculture.com. Brought to you by C&M Seeds, Syngenta Canada, and the Alberta Wheat and Barley Commission.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio. I am your host on this Wednesday, May 17th, Lyndsey Smith. Joining me now is Kelly Daynard. She's the Executive Director of Farm and Food Care Ontario. But Kelly, 20 years ago, you were the Communications Manager for the Ontario Cattlemen's Association. Welcome here, Kelly.
Thank you.
Now, so we are in this, approaching the long weekend, approaching the 20th anniversary of the BSE finding in Alberta. This is one of those, for many of us in this industry, sort of a how you heard, where were you? So let's start there. You're working in the beef industry in Ontario. How did you hear about the BSE finding in Alberta?
First of all, you're asking me to take a terrible trip down memory lane.
I'm sorry.
And,
yeah.
I think it's the May long weekend is still a bit triggering for those of us who were really involved back then. But you would think that maybe working in one of the provincial organizations in Canada, we would have heard about it in advance. But I literally, I remember the exact second. I was on a beautiful photo shoot on a cow-calf farm in Ontario, doing a photo shoot for a project that we had coming up later that year. And I was riding in the back of a pickup truck. It was a gorgeous spring day. I was having the best time, and my cell phone rang, and it was a media outlet asking me to comment on the fact that there was a case of BSE in Canada. And I'm not proud of my response, because I think my answer was, that couldn't possibly be true. I would know about it. And I didn't know about it. And a quick call back to the office to my boss at the time, Mike McMorris, confirmed that, yes, the world was falling apart. And I've never driven so fast back from a photo shoot to Guelph. And then the next few months are just an absolute blur of memories as we did literally thousands of media interviews from our office trying to tell the story of the Canadian industry.
And this, I think, is such a key difference to reflect back on 20 years, how different communications is perhaps broached now, how news spreads now. Now, I will share just briefly, I was at my very first job in ag media, and the news came across a fax. So just to put that in perspective, we got a fax, and I was actually on the phone with, at the time, our provincial forage specialist, and I was the one who told him. So to that point, it did not spread perhaps as quickly to the people that needed to hear it, maybe as it should have. However, what happened after is what is so incredibly monumental, I think, to me, in that I remember in that time the outpouring of support for the Canadian industry. But of course, someone had to get all those farmers and ranchers in front of a camera with a microphone in their face and actually get them to share what was going on. And you were part of that. So what did that look like in those days after?
So interestingly enough, and I guess probably why the May long weekend triggers me a bit is just a couple of years before that, we had the Walkerton water crisis that happened over the May long weekend. And in Ontario at that time, we realized we were very poorly prepared in terms of having beef farmers that could confidently talk about the issues that were affecting them, and you think BSE specifically. I mean, people were losing their businesses. There was no market. They had no source of income. This was absolutely crippling to Canadian farm families. But in the 2 years since Walkerton, we had done a fair bit of work to identify spokespeople, and I'm talking Ontario specific, but every province did it really well, of finding farmers across the country that were willing to tell their stories. And I remember the early days of BSE being absolutely overwhelmed by the amount of fabulous farmers that were reaching out to me saying, hey, Kelly, if you have any calls in the Ottawa area, I'm happy to help, or the Kingston area, or the Bruce County area. And I remember one farmers around Toronto are kind of a scarce breed, but I had one cow-calf farmer in particular. I think he had 3 camera crews on his farm in one day, one interview after another. And so back in the office, we were triaging calls because people sure didn't want to talk to me. They wanted to talk to a farmer, and so they should. So triaging those, daily calls, weekly calls, magazines, TV, radio. I think there were 1,000 requests that first day, but I'm really proud to say that we made that happen, and farmers were very willing to stand up and tell their stories, even though the world was crumbling around them.
Which, in that, to me, is such an important point that I'm so glad you bring up, is that it and I think about, crises that have happened since that perhaps not as wide of scale, because the cattle industry is very national, of course, concentrated in some areas. But, we've had avian influenza outbreaks in the Fraser Valley, I think about, where exactly that, like, everything in your business and in your own backyard is absolutely in chaos and threatened. And someone is asking you to stand in front of a camera and share what's happening. So how did you prep some of your farmers and ranchers to actually have that conversation and be willing to do it?
Well, and I think, for me, a lot of it went back to Walkerton 2 years earlier. We didn't do a good job of speaking up. We kind of kept our heads down and thought, oh, you know what, this is a short news clip. It's going to go away quickly. And the livestock industry was absolutely hammered by urban media, and we didn't get in front of the story, and we didn't tell the story about the great environmental, initiatives that farmers are doing across this country. And So I think we, to the point of doing a poor job in one crisis, we then rallied, and 2 years later, farmers saw the need to get in front of the story. And I mean, like I said, it was a terrible time. I remember we worked with the Ontario Farm Animal Council at the time, helping with helpline calls. And I remember one young kid calling in anonymously to the helpline asking for help because he didn't think his grandma and grandpa could afford to feed their beef cows. And, this kid would have been a young teenager at the time. And so the Cattlemen's Association was able to get involved and help find feed. But, I still think about that young boy making that call 20 years ago. And, people were absolutely just rocketing with fear. So for those that were willing to get up and tell their stories and get in front of the Canadian consumer and say, this is not a human health issue, like our system worked, we caught it. I'm still so grateful for those farmers and ranchers that did that.
So now let's talk a little bit about that public support. I mean, I think, Sean shared on the show about, and I think about it too, I think about, the beef drives, the burger lineups, I remember very distinctly like the tubes of like 10 pounds of hamburger that you could buy, that everybody was supposed to go. And, we got the stickers of I love Canadian beef and I love Alberta beef and all these sorts of things. And it really was this, this push to support our Canadian farmers and ranchers. What did that look like sort of from behind the scenes, sort of putting that together or hoping that would happen? What role there did agriculture play in trying to garner some of that support?
Well, I was driving with my mother a couple of weeks ago, and I was following an older car, and it had one of those I Love Canadian Beef bumper stickers on it. And I looked at it, and I laughed, and I'm like, okay, first of all, that bumper sticker is now 20 years old because I helped design it. And yay that it's still out there, right? But that, the response was organic. People just rose to the occasion. The beef industry did a good job of telling its story. You saw those campaigns. Consumption went up, which is absolutely unheard of in a crisis, and people just responded wholeheartedly. I mean, Anita Stewart, that is where this whole Food Day Canada thing started, was her saying, let's organize this coast-to-coast barbecue in support of Canadian beef farmers. And, whether you had a barbecue in your backyard or a community gathering or something at Queen's Park, there were barbecues from one end of this country to the other, putting beef on kitchen tables and supporting the industry. And that was heartwarming for everybody involved in the industry, because you were like, okay, you know what, we might survive because our consumers are behind us. And I think, again, the traceability system that we had did work, and we showed that, there's not a problem because the case was caught, or later the cases were caught, and this is why we have traceability in this country.
And I'm so glad you brought up Anita's name as well, in that this really is the genesis of Food Day Canada, which just, of course, last week was enshrined into law, that we will have a national Food Day Canada every August long weekend. And this really is the genesis of it.
It absolutely is. She was one of those early foodies that got behind it. And 20 years later, I think she'd be really proud to see her work.
I think so, too. Now, so let's step into a little bit of then the evolution of as we've moved through, because many people would argue that, the crisis, yes, was perhaps the first, I don't know, do we say years? It was not a short-lived, border closures and exactly, right? Like it was long-term. And the impacts of it really have been, our cow herd has shrunk every year since, essentially, right?
Yep. I saw Dennis Laycraft from the Canadian Cattle Association quoted recently as saying, we lost a generation of beef producers. And he could not be more right in that quote, because, really, I think there were 25,000 beef farmers in the province of Ontario before BSE, and I don't know, are we half that now? People got out of the industry. I remember farmers calling every single day to the office saying, when are you getting our borders open? And, the answer was, we have absolutely absolutely no idea. And then you think about the genesis of communications too. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook. I remember doing drive-in morning radio shows like at 5 o'clock in the morning out of downtown Toronto, and trying to use early days of Google to find out if there were any more cases the night before, because of course the national office was in Alberta, a couple of time zones away. And so oh my gosh, I think back, and you talked about faxes. We were trying to update cattle farmers in the province of Ontario, and we were doing a lot of that by fax. Maybe a quarter of them had email. So you just, communications is so much better. And I also think communications across the country is better. So, at the time, I didn't know my counterparts at the other cattle organizations in Canada. And now, communicators are just so good at reaching back and forth and sharing ideas. And those early days of BSE, I remember the communications manager for the Ontario fruit and vegetable growers at that time reaching out to me to say, hey, Kelly, you've probably got a total storm over there. Can I come over and help you triage? Wow. It wasn't his problem, but, we had started to build that network in Ontario, and that's growing nationally. So now we do know each other. We can text, we can tweet, we can pick up the phone, and I think communications has just come 100-fold since then.
So, and further to that, I mean, we start this discussion with where you are now with Farm and Food Care Ontario, the push and the need to not just, of course, take care of our animals, which animal welfare has been, where, that livestock handling and care was sort of what Farm and Food Care started at in its genesis, but in moving towards, so Walkerton first, then BSE. Were these driving forces to creating something like Farm and Food Care that is consumer facing?
Well, I think, Farm and Food Care, the work we do in Saskatchewan and Ontario and PEI and so many other sister groups across the country, consumers are really interested in where their food comes from. Maybe BSE helped that early days. People, would just go to the grocery store and get a piece of beef and not really think about where it came from. And certainly then they were there was this kind of a, wave the flag and serve your beef, which was amazing. And maybe that has morphed into the 100-mile diet, people being more interested in local food. Certainly COVID, every farmer's market person that I've talked to from Newfoundland to BC in the last couple of years has seen such a huge rise in interest in local products because they were going to their national chains and not getting it for a while. So, people are increasingly interested in their food, and I'm always going to think that's a good thing. And, the reason Farm and Food Care exists is because if you have a question about your food, why wouldn't you ask a farmer about it?
Absolutely. Kelly, I'm sorry that the May long weekend for so many of us is not better. But you know what? Before we had this call, I didn't really think about, for all of Canada, BSE crisis, but I hadn't thought about Walkerton before that, not that long before. And it was also the May long weekend, essentially. So I'm sorry. I didn't realize the beef industry in Ontario was so incredibly traumatized by this weekend.
And I want to give a shout out to the late Cindy McCreath, who was the communications manager at the Canadian Cattlemen's Association during those crises, because she's no longer with us, but she worked really hard in communications. And I remember that May long weekend in Walkerton, and I was having a blissfully good weekend. I was planning a barbecue. I was doing some gardening, all the things you do on a May long weekend. And her phone call to me said, "So where is Walkerton anyway?"
Oh, no.
And of course, she's calling from Calgary, and suddenly you have that twisted feeling in your stomach, and you're like, right, E. coli, cattle, this affects me, and my weekend is now something different. And we had some time to prep on that one. But the May long weekend, a couple of years, out of 3 there was a pretty challenging time for the industry. And you know what? The Canadian agriculture has been forever reshaped because of both of those crises.
Yeah, absolutely. And continues to be. All right, Kelly, thank you so much for joining me today. This has been absolutely fantastic. And I'm sorry to take you back to a terrible time, but I think all of us need to learn from it and reflect on it. And as you have so beautifully, remember those who maybe are not with us anymore, who worked very hard through this crisis to get us through it. So I appreciate that.
And just a reminder of the amazing beef farmers, all livestock really across this country, who just put their heart and soul into telling their stories and continue to do that. And I will be forever grateful for that.
Absolutely. All right, Kelly, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you to Kelly. And of course, as she says, thank you to all the ranchers who have been sharing their experiences, everyone in the industry who's been sharing their experiences, and we'd love to hear more. If you've got a story you would like to share, please call that Real Ag feedback line 1-855-776-6147 or find us on social media at Real Agriculture. You can share your thoughts, your perspective, your experience, and we'd love to hear from you. All right, one last segment, and then we're wrapping up today's show. So we'll be back with more right after this.
I get to spend every day talking to farmers in the ag industry through RealAgriculture.com and RealAg Radio. But nothing is more fun than speaking to an audience live and in person. If you're planning an ag event, book a Real Agriculture speaker to make it a successful and memorable experience. Email shaney@realagriculture.com and you can book myself or any other Real Ag personality to speak at your event. Bring your audience all the fun, insight, and energy of Real Agriculture.
Canola is more than just a pretty face in the prairie landscape. It's a big business, both here and around the world, that requires you to be informed and up to date on everything it takes to grow a successful crop. The Canola School on RealAgriculture.com has an expert library of video resources covering markets, agronomy, and more to help you grow a healthy and profitable canola crop. Visit canolaschool.com today. Brought to you by BASF Canada and Invigor Hybrid Canola.
Welcome back to Real Ag Radio on this Wednesday, May 17th. I am your host, Lyndsey Smith, and this last segment is brought to you by the 110th AGM and Convention of the Saskatchewan Stock Growers Association, happening June 4th through 6th at Moose Jaw, Saskatchewan. Registration is now open. Visit skstockgrowers.com for more information and to register. And I got an email this morning that reminded me that the block of rooms for the discounted rate, I think the deadline is today to book those rooms. So get on out there if you plan to attend. Last segment of the day, it has been an absolute joy to host today's show. But I wanted to take just a few minutes to wrap up today's show with some reflections on these important conversations that we're having about the impact that BSE has had on the Canadian cattle industry. Now, if you're not in the cattle industry or weren't before or don't plan to be, maybe, some of this is a little much. But at the same time, I think when we think back to the decades that have followed since, realistically, I don't know that there's any recent event that has had such a dramatic impact on the landscape where you might live. So here in Ontario, I am just west of Ottawa. And when we drive around this area, I've only lived in the Ottawa area for just under 10 years now. And when we tour around this area, you can see where there were so many cattle that are just not there anymore. The buildings are there. Lots of the fences have been torn out, but it is remarkable to hear about what the industry was like just a short time ago and how seemingly overnight, and honestly, as you've heard this week and as we will continue to cover this week, realistically it was. Suddenly, the prices fell out. You couldn't even sell cattle if you wanted to. There simply weren't buyers. It was a crisis of epic proportions. It was an incredibly impactful event, and we really have a Canadian cattle industry now that is forever changed because of it. And so, while you heard from Kelly, you hear us, sort of reflect back and perhaps laugh a little about, just how terrible it was. The laugh is not meant to be funny in any way. It's really a part of coping. And for so many, and unfortunately there were some pretty significant dark days for a lot of people. And it is an event and a time and a process that we really do need to remember and think about what everyone went through and how it has shaped our careers. And so with that, I say thank you to everyone who has been willing to share. We are asking, of course, if you would like to tell your story or share with us, we would really appreciate it. And we have been hearing some remarkable stories about resiliency, the pain, the retiring, the selling out, all that has had to happen to adapt and to keep farming. So thank you for all of those. You can, of course, call the feedback line 1-855-776-6147 if you'd like to share more, or find us on social media at Real Agriculture. I am Lyndsey Smith. I will talk to you Friday on the Issues panel. Until then, take care.
Thank you for downloading this episode of RealAg Radio, brought to you by Ag Expert. Go from field to farm with Canada's most trusted, most secure farm management software. Ag Expert keeps you on top of it all, no matter where you are. Get started for free at agexpert.ca.